It was a winter that froze the breath in your lungs before you could even scream. In the unforgiving Montana territory of 1887, survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a brutal daily war. Sarah Miller, a widow left with nothing but debts and a freezing cabin, thought she was fighting that war alone. She was wrong. When a shadow emerged from the tree line, a man the locals called a savage, a ghost, a killer, she thought her end had come. Instead, he looked at her bleeding hands, took the axe from her grip, and spoke 7 words that would change history. You don't have to do that anymore. But this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a scandal that would burn Iron Ridge to the ground. The cold in Iron Ridge didn't just sit on your skin, it hunted you. It found the gaps in the chinking of the log walls. It seeped through the soles of worn-out leather boots, and it settled deep in the bones of anyone foolish enough to try and live on the edge of the Bitterroot Range. Sarah Miller dragged the hem of her woolen skirt through the snow, the fabric heavy and wet, freezing solid around her ankles. Her breath came in ragged, white puffs. She was 24 years old, but looking at her reflection in the iced-over horse trough that morning, she felt 50. Her hands were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding, wrapped in rags that were turning gray with grime. Just 3 more, she whispered to the empty forest. Just 3 more logs. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 6 months. A mining accident up at the Copper King claim. A rockfall that hadn't just crushed his chest, but crushed Sarah's future along with it. The mining company, run by the ruthless Elias Vane, had paid her precisely $10 in compensation, enough for a coffin and a week's worth of flour. Now, the flour was gone, the woodpile was a scattering of bark chips, and the storm coming down from the north looked like it wanted to bury the entire territory. Sarah swung the dull axe. It bounced off the frozen pine log, jarring her shoulder. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of frustration and pain. She swung again, and again. The vibration rattled her teeth. She was starving, she was exhausted, and she was alone. Or so she thought. The silence of the woods changed first. The birds had already fled the coming storm, but the heavy, oppressive quiet that descended was different. It was the silence of a predator. Sarah lowered the axe, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned slowly. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless. He was massive. That was her first thought. He wore a coat made of bear fur that made his shoulders look twice as wide as a normal man's. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered Stetson and a thick, dark beard that was frosted with ice. A Sharps rifle was slung effortlessly over one shoulder. The townspeople of Iron Ridge spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones. Silas Kincaid, the mountain man. Some said he was a deserter from the Civil War who had killed his commanding officer. Others said he was half wolf. They said he came down from the high peaks only to trade furs for ammunition and whiskey, and that he had once killed a grizzly with a Bowie knife. Sarah gripped the handle of her axe, though she knew it would be useless against a man like this. I have no money, she said, her voice trembling but loud. And I have no food. If you've come to rob me, you're wasting your time. Silas didn't move. His eyes, dark and unreadable, tracked from her face down to her trembling hands, then to the pathetic pile of wet wood she had managed to gather. He took a step forward. The snow crunched loudly under his boots. Sarah stepped back, her boot catching on a root. She stumbled, falling hard into the snowbank. The cold bite was immediate. She scrambled to get up, panic rising in her throat, but his shadow fell over her. He reached down. Sarah flinched, closing her eyes, waiting for the blow. It never came. Instead, a gloved hand, huge, smelling of pine resin and wood smoke, closed around the handle of the axe she was still clutching. He didn't pull it away roughly. He just held it until she let go. She opened her eyes. Silas Kincaid was looking down at her. Up close, he didn't look like a wolf. He looked tired. There was a scar running through his left eyebrow, and his eyes weren't black, but a piercing, clear gray, like the winter sky. He tossed the axe to the side. It landed with a thud. Get up, he said. His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. Sarah scrambled to her feet, brushing snow from her skirt. I need that wood. I have to. No, He cut her off. He looked at the bleeding rags on her hands. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked toward her cabin, a sad, tilting structure barely visible through the trees, smoke barely trickling from the chimney. He looked back at her, his gaze intense, stripping away her defenses. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said. Sarah blinked, confused. "What?" "You don't have to do that anymore," he repeated, firmer this time. Before she could ask what he meant, Silas turned. He walked to the fallen pine tree she had been hacking at for an hour. He didn't use her axe. He pulled a long-handled double-bit axe from a loop on his pack. With a swing that looked deceptively easy, he drove the blade through the frozen wood. Crack. In 10 minutes, he had done what would have taken Sarah 3 days. He had a stack of split logs waist high. Without a word, he gathered an armful, an amount Sarah couldn't have lifted if her life depended on it, and began walking toward her cabin. "Wait!" Sarah ran after him, her boots slipping. "You can't just... Why are you doing this?" He didn't stop. He walked right up to her porch, kicked the door open, and dumped the wood next to the dying hearth. He knelt, his large frame filling the tiny room, and began to build up the fire. He moved with a competence that was mesmerizing. Within moments, the fire was roaring, the heat pushing back the damp chill of the room. He stood up, brushing bark dust from his gloves. He looked around the cabin. He saw the empty flour sack on the table. He saw the single, thin blanket on her bed. He saw the photo of Thomas on the mantel, the glass cracked. Sarah stood in the doorway, shivering, not from cold anymore, but from shock. "Mr. Kincaid, I can't pay you." Silas walked past her, back out into the snow. He stopped at the porch steps. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out a wrapped parcel. He set it on the railing. It was heavy. "Venison," he said. "Fresh. Why?" Sarah asked again, tears pricking her eyes. "They say you hate people. They say you want to be left alone." Silas paused. He looked at her, and for a second, the hardness in his face softened. "The storm's going to last 3 days. Don't go outside." "But..." "I'll be back," he said. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the mountain man walked back into the white blur of the forest, leaving Sarah Miller with a roaring fire, a stack of meat, and a question that would haunt her. Why her? The storm did last 3 days, just as Silas had predicted. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the cabin to its foundations. But for the first time in months, Sarah was warm. The venison stew she made filled her belly, giving her a strength she had almost forgotten. But with the warmth came the fear. In Iron Ridge, a woman alone did not accept charity from a man, especially not a man like Silas Kincaid, without consequences. Gossip in the territory traveled faster than the telegraph. On the 4th morning, the sun broke through, glittering on 4 feet of fresh snow. Sarah was sweeping the hearth when a heavy pounding shook her door. Her heart leaped. Silas? She opened the door, a small smile already forming on her lips. The smile died instantly. It wasn't Silas. Standing on her porch was Sheriff Jubal Hallow, and behind him, sitting atop a magnificent black stallion, was Elias Vane. Elias Vane was the richest man in the territory. He owned the mine, the general store, the bank, and, for all intents and purposes, the sheriff. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, dressed in a tailored wool coat with a silk vest. "Mrs. Miller," Vane said, tipping his hat. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We were worried. The storm was severe. We feared you might have succumbed." "I'm fine, Mr. Vane," Sarah said, tightening her grip on the broom. "As you can see." Vane's eyes darted past her, into the cabin. He sniffed the air. "Is that venison I smell? A rich stew?" Sarah stepped to block his view. "I had supplies put by." "Strange," Vane said, swinging down from his horse. He landed softly in the snow. "According to the ledger at my store, I haven't bought meat or flour in 3 weeks, and your account is, well, let's just say it's beyond overdue." He walked up the steps, invading her space. "We found something, Sarah. Up at the mine?" "Found what?" "A discrepancy," Vane said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. "It seems your late husband, Thomas, wasn't just a clumsy miner. We found evidence that he was skimming high-grade ore, stealing from the company. Sarah gasped. "That's a lie! Thomas was an honest man!" "The ledger says otherwise," Vane said smoothly. "He owes the company $500. Since he has passed, the debt falls to his estate. To you. $500? Sarah laughed, a hysterical, jagged sound. "I don't have 500 cents!" Vane stepped closer. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale tobacco. "I know, which is why I'm here to offer a solution. I am a reasonable man, Sarah. I've always admired you. You're resilient." He reached out, his gloved finger tracing the line of her jaw. Sarah jerked her head back. "Don't touch me." Vane's face hardened. "I will take the cabin." "The land. It sits on a vein I want to prospect. Sign the deed over to me, and I will forgive the debt. You can come work at the saloon in town. I'll ensure you have a comfortable position." The implication was clear. He wanted her to be a saloon girl, a prostitute. "Get off my property," Sarah hissed. Sheriff Hallow stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Now, Mrs. Miller, don't be unreasonable. Mr. Vane is being generous." "I said get out!" Vane sighed. "You have until sundown tomorrow, Sarah. Sign the deed, or the sheriff evicts you. And in winter eviction is a death sentence." They turned to leave. Vane paused at the bottom of the steps. He looked at the woodpile, the neatly split logs that Silas had left. "That's fine work," Vane noted, his eyes narrowing. "Thomas didn't split that. And you certainly didn't. You have a visitor, Mrs. Miller? That's none of your business." Vane's eyes went cold. "If it's who I think it is, tell him he's trespassing. And tell him the past doesn't stay buried forever." As they rode away, Sarah slumped against the doorframe. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt very far away. She was trapped. She had 24 hours to lose everything. She needed help. But who? The town had turned its back on her. She looked toward the tree line, toward the high peaks of the Bitterroot Range. She didn't wait. She grabbed her coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and shoved her husband's old Colt Navy revolver into her pocket. It only had 3 bullets, and the timing was off. But it was heavy and cold and made her feel slightly less helpless. She began to walk. Not toward town. Toward the mountain. She followed the tracks Silas had left 3 days ago. They were faint, half buried by the wind, but she found them. She walked for hours, her legs burning, the air thinning as she climbed. She found his cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. It was built into the side of a cliff, hidden by a grove of aspen. It was a fortress of logs and stone. She collapsed at the front door, pounding on it with her frozen fist. "Silas! Silas, please!" The door swung open. Silas Kincaid stood there, stripped to his shirt sleeves, a skinning knife in his hand. He looked down at her, his face thunderous. "You shouldn't be here," he growled. "It's not safe." "Vane," Sarah gasped out, her lungs burning. "Elias Vane. He's taking the cabin. He says Thomas stole from him. He gave me until sundown tomorrow." At the mention of the name Vane, Silas went still. The knife in his hand stopped moving. His gray eyes darkened, shifting from the color of the sky to the color of a stormy sea. He reached out, grabbed her arm, and pulled her inside. "Tell me everything," he said. "Every word that Snake said," Sarah told him. When she finished, Silas didn't speak for a long time. He walked to the window, looking down toward the valley where the lights of Iron Ridge were just flickering on. "He's lying," Silas said softly. "Thomas didn't steal anything." "How do you know?" Sarah asked. Silas turned to face her. The firelight cast long shadows across his scarred face. "Because," Silas said, "Elias Vane is the reason I'm up here. He's the reason I lost my family, and he's the reason I'm going to kill him." Sarah stared at him. The drama had just shifted. She had come for a savior, but she had found an avenger. "Who are you, Silas?" she whispered. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He threw the lid open. Inside wasn't furs or gold. It was a uniform, a U.S. Marshal's badge, and a stack of wanted posters. "My name isn't just Silas Kincaid," he said. 10 years ago, I was Marshal Silas Kincaid, and Elias Vane. He was my prisoner, the one that got away. The revelation hung in the cold air of the mountain cabin like smoke after a gunshot. Marshall. The word didn't seem to fit the wild, bearded man standing before her, yet as Sarah looked closer, she saw the posture beneath the bear-hide coat. He stood with the rigid, disciplined spine of a man used to giving orders and enforcing the law. "If you're a marshal," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, "why are you hiding on a mountain? Why does everyone think you're a savage?" Silas picked up the badge. It was tarnished, the silver dulled by time and neglect. He ran a thumb over the star. "Because the law failed, Sarah. 10 years ago, Elias Vane wasn't a mine owner. He was a banker in Kansas. He ran a scheme selling land bonds that didn't exist to war widows. I tracked him for 3 months. I caught him." Silas's hand clenched around the badge until his knuckles turned white. "I brought him in. But Vane, he has a silver tongue and deep pockets. He bought the judge. He bought the jury. He walked free. And 2 nights later, the boarding house where I was staying, where my wife, Martha, was waiting for me, burned to the ground. Sarah covered her mouth, a gasp escaping her throat. They said it was an accident," Silas continued, his voice void of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. "But I knew. I tried to kill him in the street. I was stopped, stripped of my rank, branded a loose cannon. Vane disappeared out west to reinvent himself. I followed him. I've been watching him build his empire here in Iron Ridge, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for the right moment to tear it all down." He looked at Sarah. "I didn't expect him to come after you. But now that he has, he's made his mistake." Sarah felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She had spent the last 6 months feeling like a leaf blown by the wind, helpless against the forces of nature and greed. Now, she was standing next to a storm. "He's coming tomorrow at sundown," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "He's bringing the sheriff." Silas moved to the wall, pulling down a Winchester lever-action rifle. He tossed it onto the bed, then began filling a bandolier with cartridges. The metallic click-clack was rhythmic, hypnotic. "Jubal Hallow is a weak man," Silas said. "He's not evil, but he's bought. He won't shoot first, but his deputies might. And Vane always hires muscle. We need to be ready." He turned to her. "Can you shoot?" Sarah hesitated. Thomas taught me a little. To scare off coyotes." Silas picked up the Colt Navy she had brought. He checked the cylinder. 3 bullets, he muttered. "A coyote won't shoot back. A hired gun will." He motioned for her to follow him outside. The twilight was bleeding into night, the snow glowing blue in the moonlight. Silas set up 3 empty tin cans on a fence post 20 yards away. "Aim," he commanded. Sarah raised the heavy pistol. Her arm wavered. Silas stepped behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his chest against her back. "Breathe," he murmured near her ear. "Don't squeeze the trigger. Pull it. Slow. Like you're threading a needle." Sarah inhaled the sharp winter air. She focused on the center can. She exhaled, and as her lungs emptied, she pulled. Bang! The kickback jarred her wrist, but the middle can pinged and flew off the post. "Good," Silas said. Again, for the next hour, until the moon was high and bright, they practiced. Silas was a relentless teacher. He taught her how to reload with shaking fingers, how to use the porch railing for stability, how to listen for the snap of a twig that meant someone was flanking her. By the time they went back inside, Sarah's hands were black with gunpowder and her ears were ringing. But the fear that had been paralyzing her was gone. It was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. They ate a silent meal of dried beef and beans. When it was time to sleep, Silas threw a blanket roll onto the floor by the door. "You take the bed," he said. "Silas," Sarah said, sitting on the edge of the mattress. "Why did you help me? That first day. You didn't know about Vane then." Silas lay down, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. "I saw you chopping that wood. You looked like you were fighting a war you couldn't win. But you kept swinging that axe." He turned his head, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "I admire grit, Sarah, and I haven't seen much of it lately." Sarah lay back, pulling the quilt up to her chin. For the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel alone. She felt safe. And as she drifted off, She realized with a start that her heart wasn't just beating for survival anymore. It was beating for the man sleeping across the room. The sun began its descent, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood orange. The deadline was approaching. Sarah and Silas had descended the mountain at dawn. They had spent the day fortifying Sarah's cabin. Silas had boarded up the back windows, leaving only narrow firing slits. He had overturned the heavy oak table to create a barricade near the door. He had even doused the front steps with water, watching grimly as it froze into a sheet of invisible, treacherous ice. Now, they waited. Sarah sat behind the overturned table, the Winchester resting on her shoulder. Silas stood by the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. He had shaved his beard down to a heavy stubble, revealing a jawline that looked carved from granite. He looked younger, but more dangerous. He was no longer the hermit. He was the marshal. "Dust," Silas said calmly. "5 riders." Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle. "Is it him? It's Vane. Hollow." "And 3 men I don't recognize. Hired guns. Probably from Deadwood." The sound of hooves thundered into the clearing, stopping abruptly. There was silence for a moment, then the creak of leather as men dismounted. "Mrs. Miller!" Vane's voice drifted through the door, smooth and arrogant. "The sun is down. Have you made your decision? Or do we need to help you pack?" Silas looked at Sarah. He nodded. Sarah took a breath. "I'm not going anywhere, Elias," she shouted. "And neither is the deed to this land." A chuckle outside. "A pity. Boys, remove the door." Footsteps crunched on the snow. 2 men approached the porch. As soon as the first boot hit the ice steps, the man's leg flew out from under him. He crashed down hard, cursing loudly. "Watch your step," Silas muttered. "Who's in there with you?" "Sarah," Sheriff Hallow called out, sounding nervous. "Come on now. Don't make this a bloodbath." Silas stepped away from the window and walked to the door. He unbarred it. Sarah's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Changing the terms," Silas said. He kicked the door open and stepped out onto the porch, the Sharp's rifle held loosely in one hand. The sight of him froze the men in the yard. The hired guns reached for their holsters, but stopped when they saw the size of him. Vane, sitting on his horse near the tree line, went pale. "Silas," Vane whispered. It was the first time Sarah had ever heard fear in his voice. "Hello, Elias," Silas said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the clearing. "It's been a long time." "You're dead," Vane said, his voice rising in pitch. "I heard you died in the Rockies." "Disappointed?" Silas smirked. He looked at the sheriff. "Jubal, you're standing with a murderer and a thief." Sheriff Hallow shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Silas, don't start trouble. Mr. Vane has a legal claim." "He has nothing!" Silas roared, the sudden volume making the horses spook. He fabricated the debt, just like he fabricated the bonds in Kansas, just like he rigged the accident that killed Thomas Miller. The air left the clearing. Sarah, standing in the doorway behind Silas, felt her knees buckle. "Rigged the accident?" "That's slander," Vane snapped, regaining his composure. "Kill him! He's a trespasser! Shoot him!" The 3 hired guns looked at Vane, then at Silas. They were mercenaries, but they weren't stupid. They knew a predator when they saw one. "I'll pay double!" Vane screamed. That was enough. The man on the right went for his gun. He never cleared leather. Silas fired the Sharps from the hip. The boom was deafening, like a cannon shot. The heavy slug hit the hired gun in the shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him into the snow. The other 2 men scrambled for cover behind the water truck. Bullets began to chew up the wood of the porch railing. "Inside!" Silas shoved Sarah back into the cabin and kicked the door shut just as a bullet splintered the jamb. "He killed Thomas?" Sarah screamed over the noise of the gunfire. "You knew?" "I suspected," Silas said, moving to the window and firing 2 quick shots. Vane doesn't leave loose ends. If Thomas found something in that mine, Vane wouldn't just fire him. Glass shattered as a bullet struck the whiskey bottle on the shelf. "They're pinning us down," Silas said, analyzing the situation with cold detachment. "They'll try to burn us out next. Vane doesn't care about the cabin anymore. He just wants us dead." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, racking the lever of her Winchester. "We go on the offense." Silas looked at her. "I need you to cover the back. If they circle around, shoot to kill. Can you do that? Sarah looked at the photo of Thomas on the mantel. She thought of the months of starvation, the cold, the cruelty of Elias Vane. Her fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Yes, she said. Silas looked at her, and for a fleeting second, he reached out and cupped her cheek. His hand was rough, but his touch was gentle. You're a hell of a woman, Sarah Miller. Then he turned and smashed the back window out with the butt of his rifle. Cover me. Silas dove out the back window, rolling into the deep snow. Sarah stepped up to the opening, her rifle raised. She saw a shadow moving through the trees, one of the hired guns trying to flank them. She remembered Silas's voice. Breathe. Squeeze. She fired. The man yelled and dropped his gun, clutching his leg. I got one, she yelled. From the front of the house, chaos erupted. Silas had circled the cabin. He came up on the blind side of the men behind the trough. He didn't shoot them. He pistol-whipped one into unconsciousness and held the other at gunpoint. Drop it, Silas roared. The shooting stopped. Silas dragged the gunman into the open, using him as a shield. Vane, call them off, or your man dies. Vane was still on his horse, but he was backing away. You're a madman! Kincaid! I'm a marshal! Silas yelled back. He reached into his coat and pulled out the tarnished star, pinning it to his chest. Even in the dim light, it caught the reflection of the moon. And you're under arrest, Vane laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. You have no authority here! This isn't your jurisdiction! He turned his horse. This isn't over! You want war? I'll bring the whole town down on you! Vane spurred his horse and galloped away into the darkness. Sheriff Hallow lingered for a moment, looking at Silas, then at the wounded men. He shook his head, holstered his gun, and rode after Vane. Silas shoved the hostage away. Get your friends and get out. Tell everyone in Iron Ridge that if they come back to this cabin, they better bring a coffin. The hired men, bleeding and battered, scrambled onto their horses and fled. Silence returned to the clearing. The smell of gunpowder was heavy in the air. Sarah walked out onto the porch. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Silas stood in the snow, watching the road. He turned to her. There was blood on his cheek, a graze from a splinter of wood. Sarah ran down the steps. She didn't think. She just collided with him, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in the bear fur coat. Silas stiffened for a moment, then his arms came around her, holding her tight. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He'll be back, Silas whispered into her hair. He'll bring 50 men next time. I don't care, Sarah said, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were fierce. Let him come. Silas looked down at her lips. The tension between them, forged in violence and survival, finally snapped. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a claiming of life in the face of death. Sarah kissed him back, her hands tangling in his beard. When they pulled apart, breathless, Silas rested his forehead against hers. We can't stay here, he said. If we want to end this, we have to go to the source. We have to go to the mine. To find what Thomas found? Yes, Silas said. Tonight, while Vane is licking his wounds, we're going into the belly of the beast. The Copper King mine sat on the ridge overlooking the town like a black, gaping maw. Steam engines chugged rhythmically, pumping water from the deep shafts, the sound echoing like a mechanical heartbeat. It was past midnight. Sarah and Silas had left a mile back, approaching the industrial complex on foot. They moved through the shadows of the slag heaps, invisible against the soot-stained ground. Vane keeps the records in the foreman's office, Silas whispered, pointing to a corrugated tin shack near the main lift. But if Thomas found something physical, it would be down in the tunnels. Thomas worked on level 4, Sarah said. He mentioned it in his letters. He said the air was bad down there. Bad air usually means they're hiding something, Silas noted. Ventilation costs money. They slipped past a sleeping guard, Silas moving with the silent grace of the mountain lion the locals compared him to. They reached the mine entrance. The cage, a rickety iron elevator, was waiting. Silas operated the levers. The steam winch hissed, and they began to descend. The world above disappeared. The air grew warmer and thicker, smelling of sulfur and wet earth. The light from their oil lantern cast dancing, grotesque shadows on the wet rock walls. "Level 4, Silas said as the cage clanked to a halt. They stepped out into a cavernous tunnel. It was silent here, away from the pumps. Rails for ore carts ran into the darkness. Thomas said he was working the north vein. Sarah whispered. They walked for 20 minutes, deeper into the earth. The timber supports creaked ominously. "Look," Silas said, stopping and holding the lantern high. The tunnel ended in a wall of rock. But it wasn't natural. It was a fresh collapse. They blasted it shut, Silas said, touching the jagged rocks. "Why seal a vein if it's producing?" He knelt, picking up a rock from the floor. He examined it, then smashed it against the wall. It crumbled easily. "It's low grade," Silas muttered. "Fool's gold and copper dust. This mine is tapped out, Sarah. There's nothing here." "But Vane is selling shares," Sarah said, realization dawning on her. "He's telling everyone it's the richest strike in the territory. He's salting it," Silas said, "bringing in high-grade ore from somewhere else, scattering it for the inspectors to find, pumping up the stock price. Once he sells his shares, he'll disappear, and the town will be left with a hole in the ground." "And Thomas found out," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. "He must have found the stockpile. The ore Vane was using to salt the mine." Silas looked around. "It has to be close." He noticed a side tunnel, boarded up with hastily nailed planks. A sign read, "Danger, gas paquette, gas pocket," Silas scoffed. "Or a hiding spot." He pried the boards loose with the barrel of his rifle. They squeezed through. Inside, stacked in crates, stamped with the mark of a mine in Nevada, was the proof. High-grade gold and copper quartz, enough to fake a massive strike. And sitting on top of one of the crates was a small, leather-bound book. Sarah grabbed it. "It's Thomas's handwriting," she said, tears welling up. "It's his shift log. He wrote it all down. October 14th. Saw Vane's men unloading Nevada crates. Confronted foreman, told to keep mouth shut." "This is it," Silas said. "This proves the fraud, and it gives Vane a motive for murder." Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "What was that?" Sarah asked. Silas's eyes widened. He grabbed her arm. "Run!" They scrambled back through the boarded opening. The rumble grew louder. The sound of the elevator cage descending rapidly. Lights appeared at the far end of the tunnel. Lots of them. "Well, well," Vane's voice echoed down the shaft, amplified by the stone. "I had a feeling you were smarter than you looked, Kincaid." Silas pulled Sarah behind an ore cart. "He knew we'd come. You walked right into the trap," Vane called out. "And you saved me the trouble of digging a grave. This level is unstable, you know. A single stick of dynamite could bring the whole mountain down." Silas checked his rifle. "We have to move. Now." "Where? The elevator is the only way out," Sarah cried. "No," Silas said, looking at a rusted ventilation shaft set high in the wall. "Not the only way." A gunshot sparked off the rail near their feet. Vane's men were advancing, firing blindly into the dark. "Boost me up," Silas ordered. He laced his fingers together. Sarah stepped into his hands, and he launched her upward. She scrambled into the narrow, soot-choked vent. She reached down. "Take my hand!" Silas jumped, grabbing her wrist. She strained, her muscles screaming as she hauled his heavy frame up. He scrambled into the vent just as the tunnel below them erupted in gunfire. "They're in the vent!" a voice yelled. "Blow it!" Vane screamed. "Blow the supports! Go!" Silas pushed Sarah forward. The vent was tight, barely wide enough to crawl. They scurried like rats, the metal tearing at their clothes. Behind them, a massive boom shook the world. The shockwave hit them, slamming them against the metal walls. The tunnel they had just been in collapsed, the roar of falling rock deafening. The dust cloud chased them, choking and blinding, but they kept crawling, upward, following the draft of air. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah saw a patch of stars. They tumbled out of the ventilation exit on the side of the mountain, gasping for air, covered in black soot. They were alive. Below them, the ground shuddered as the lower levels of the Copper King mine collapsed in on themselves. Silas stood up, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. He looked at Sarah, who was clutching Thomas's logbook to her chest like a shield. "We have the evidence," Silas said, his voice grim. "But now we have no home, no fortress. We're out in the open. Where do we go?" Sarah asked. Silas looked toward the town of Iron Ridge, glowing in the distance. "We don't run anymore," Silas said. "Tomorrow is Sunday. The whole town will be at the church. Vane will be there, playing the grieving businessman." He checked the load in his Sharps rifle. "We're going to church, Sarah." The church bell of Iron Ridge tolled across the valley, a solemn, brassy sound that usually signaled peace. But on this Sunday morning, the air in the town was thick, with a tension that made the horses hitch at the rails skittish. Inside the white clapboard church, the entire town had gathered. Reverend Blackwood stood at the pulpit, but he wasn't the one commanding the room. That honor belonged to Elias Vane. Vane stood before the congregation, his hat held humbly over his heart, his suit immaculate. He looked like the picture of a grieving, benevolent leader. "My friends," Vane said, his voice trembling with practiced emotion, "it is with a heavy heart I tell you that the Copper King is no more. Last night, anarchists, saboteurs led by the fugitive Silas Kincaid, destroyed the main shaft. They have not only attacked my property, they have attacked your future. They have attacked the livelihood of every family in Iron Ridge." A murmur of anger rippled through the pews. Men clenched their fists. Women pulled their shawls tighter. "But fear not," Vane continued, his voice rising. "I have sent riders to the governor. We will hunt this madman down. We will restore order. And I promise you, I will personally fund the rebuilding effort." Bam! The double doors at the back of the church didn't just open. They were kicked inward with such force that one of them cracked against the wall. The congregation spun around in their pews. The silence that followed was absolute. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the blinding white snow, were two figures. They looked like they had crawled out of hell. Their clothes were shredded and black with soot. Their faces were smeared with dried blood and coal dust. Sarah Miller stood tall, clutching a rifle in one hand and a leather book in the other. Beside her, looming like a grim reaper, was Silas Kincaid. His Sharps rifle was leveled at the pulpit. "You won't be rebuilding anything, Elias," Silas said. His voice was a low growl, but it carried to the rafters. Vane's face went the color of chalk. "Sheriff!" he shrieked. "Arrest them! They admitted it! They blew up the mine!" Sheriff Jubal Hallow stood up from the front pew, his hand moving to his gun. "Silas, put the weapon down. You're desecrating the house of God." "The only thing desecrating this church," Sarah cried out, stepping forward, "is that liar standing at the altar." She marched down the center aisle. The townspeople shrank back from her, but she didn't flinch. She held the leather book high. "You want to know why the mine collapsed?" Sarah shouted. "Because there was nothing in it! It was empty! Vane blew the supports to hide the truth." "She's lying," Vane yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. "She's hysterical. The grief over her husband has driven her mad. My husband isn't the one who wrote this." Sarah stopped 10 feet from Vane. He slammed the book down on the communion table. "This is Thomas's logbook. He documented the shipments from Nevada. He documented the bribes. And he documented the threat you made against his life 2 days before he died." She turned to the crowd, finding the eyes of the miners she knew. "Vane has been salting the mine. The stock you bought? The shares you traded your life savings for? They're worthless paper. He was going to sell out and leave you all to starve." The murmur in the room changed. It wasn't anger at Sarah anymore. It was a dawning, horrified realization. "Jubal," Silas called out, his eyes never leaving Vane. "You knew Vane was crooked in Kansas. Don't tell me you're blind here, too. Read the book." Sheriff Hallow looked at Vane, then at the book. He walked slowly to the table. He opened the soot-stained pages. He read for a long moment. When he looked up, his face was hard. "It's all here, Elias," Hallow said quietly. "Dates, times, signatures. It's a forgery!" Vane backed away, bumping into the pulpit. He looked toward the side door, where 3 of his hired guns were standing, hands hovering over their pistols. "Kill them! All of them!" The hired guns drew. "Get down!" Silas roared. He didn't fire at Vane. He fired at the lead gunman. The heavy caliber bullet took the man in the chest, throwing him back through the vestry door. Pandemonium erupted. The congregation screamed and dove under the pews. Sarah dropped to one knee, levering her Winchester. She fired, shattering the window above the second gunman's head, forcing him to duck. Vane saw his chance. With the sheriff distracted and Silas engaging the gunman, Vane reached into his coat and pulled out a Derringer, a small, two-shot pistol. He aimed it directly at Sarah's back. "No!" The shout came from Sheriff Hallow. The older lawman threw himself in front of Sarah just as Vane pulled the trigger. Pop! Hallow grunted, stumbling back, clutching his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He drew his peacemaker and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the heavy Bible on the pulpit, sending paper flying, missing Vane by an inch. Vane scrambled, running for the back exit behind the choir loft. "Sarah, stay here!" Silas yelled. He vaulted over a pew, ignoring the return fire from the remaining gunmen, and sprinted after Vane. The chase spilled out of the church and into the snowy graveyard behind it. Vane was running hard, his breath coming in ragged gasps, slipping on the ice. He scrambled over a low stone wall, heading for the tree line where his horse was tied. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. "It's over, Elias." Vane froze. He turned slowly. Silas stood 10 paces away. He had dropped his rifle. He stood with his hands hanging loose at his sides, his coat open to reveal the tarnished marshal's star on his chest. "You can't shoot me," Vane sneered, regaining a sliver of his arrogance. "You're a lawman, right? You have to bring me in. And if you bring me in, I'll buy the jury again. I'll be out in a week." Vane raised the Derringer. He had one shot left. "You're right," Silas said softly. "I am a lawman." Silas moved. It was a blur of motion that the eye could barely track. As Vane fired, Silas twisted, the bullet grazing his coat. In the same motion, Silas drew the Colt Navy from his hip, the gun Sarah had given him, the gun that belonged to Thomas Miller. Bang! The shot echoed off the mountains. Elias Vane staggered. He looked down at his chest, where a red blossom was spreading across his silk vest. He looked up at Silas, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He collapsed backward into the snow, his eyes staring blankly at the winter sky. Silas holstered the smoking gun. He walked over, looked down at the man who had ruined his life, and felt nothing. The hate was gone. The fire was out. "Case closed," Silas whispered. He turned back to the church. Sarah was running through the graveyard toward him, her hair flying wild, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. She didn't stop until she slammed into him. Silas caught her, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck. They stood there in the cold silence of the graveyard, holding on to each other as if they were the only two people left on Earth. The scandal of Iron Ridge made headlines as far east as Chicago. The Great Copper Fraud. The Tyrant's Fall. Reporters came in droves to see the collapsed mine and the grave of Elias Vane. The town itself was quiet. The economy had collapsed overnight. The shares were worthless. Many families packed up and left, heading for the silver mines in Colorado or the timber camps in Oregon. But not everyone left. 3 months later, the spring thaw had finally come to the Bitterroot. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, revealing a valley that was lush and green. On the porch of the cabin that had once been a freezing death trap, Sarah Miller sat in a rocking chair, shelling peas. The roof had been repaired. The woodpile was stacked high, not out of desperation, but out of preparation. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. Silas was coming up the path from the creek. He wasn't wearing the bear coat anymore. He wore a simple flannel shirt and canvas trousers, his sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms. He was carrying a string of fresh trout. He walked up the steps, his gait easy and relaxed. The darkness that had haunted his eyes for a decade was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. He hung the fish on a hook by the door and leaned against the railing, looking at her. "Sheriff Hallow stopped by while you were at the creek," Sarah said, tossing a pod into the bucket. "Oh?" Silas wiped his hands on a rag. "How's the shoulder?" "Healing. He's retiring next month. He says the town council had a meeting last night." Silas raised an eyebrow. "And? They want a new sheriff," Someone the people trust. Someone who isn't afraid of the rich or the powerful. Sarah smiled, her eyes dancing. They want you, Silas. Silas snorted, looking out over the valley. I'm done with badges, Sarah. I told you that. I told them you'd say that, Sarah said. So I made a counteroffer. Silas turned to her. You did you? I told them you were busy. She stood up, brushing her skirt. She walked over to him, placing her hands on his chest. I told them you were busy building a ranch, the Miller Kincaid Ranch. Silas looked down at her. Miller Kincaid? Well, Sarah teased, it is my land. True, Silas murmured. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. But I split the wood. You did, she whispered, leaning up to kiss him. The kiss was slow and sweet, tasting of promise and sunlight. When they broke apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. I have something for you, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a ring. It wasn't a diamond. It was a band of polished gold quartz, the very ore that Thomas had found, the evidence that had saved them. Silas had cut and polished it himself. I don't have much, Sarah, Silas said, his voice husky. I have a bad past and a lot of scars. But everything I have and everything I am, it's yours, if you'll have me. Sarah looked at the ring, then at the man who had walked out of the forest and saved her life with 7 words. She thought about the fear, the cold, and the loneliness, and she realized that those things felt like a different lifetime. Put it on, she whispered. Silas slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. You know, Silas said, looking at her hands. Hands that were no longer bleeding, but strong and capable. I meant what I said that first day. You don't have to do it anymore. You don't have to be alone. I know, Sarah said. She rested her head on his shoulder, watching the sun dip behind the mountains they had conquered together. I'm not alone. I'm home. While the story of Silas and Sarah is often romanticized in dime novels, records from the Montana Territory Census of 1890 show a Silas Kincaid and Sarah Kincaid listed as the owners of the largest cattle ranch in the Bitterroot Valley. Local legend says that until the day he died in 1922, Silas Kincaid chopped wood for his wife every single morning, never letting her lift an axe again. And that is the legend of the ghost of Bitterroot Mountain. What started as a desperate act of survival turned into a war for justice, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the Wild West wasn't the cold or the guns. It was a woman with nothing left to lose, and a man who finally found something to fight for. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more gritty tales of romance and survival from the frontier, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. What did you think of Silas's decision at the end? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.